Because we are able to observe many different realities, and because we can position ourselves based on these various realities. We also possess many different rationalities. Our knowledge is always limited, and the framework we draw is what actually takes place. If we apply the same thing to religion, we have to say this: what exists may be limitless, but our knowledge about it will always be limited.
Hello to everyone from Istanbul School. Dear viewers, this week we will be talking about the rationality of religious beliefs. Our guest is Dr. Yasin Ramazan. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you to be here.
How are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Thank you very much. Professor, we'd like to talk about the rationality of religion. If you'd like, let's start with a definition. What do we understand by rationality? What should we understand? What does rationality mean?
Rationality means following a traceable path toward any goal. So, what separates rational choices from non-rational ones, and rational beliefs from non-rational beliefs, is fundamentally our aim to have beliefs that correspond to reality.
Having beliefs that correspond to reality. Well, if this reality is the one we see and witness in the world, then how should we understand supernatural events in religion? How can we see the overlap here?
Of course, rationality needs to be seen as the effort to align with reality. In other words, the effort to be in accordance with reality. But being in accordance with reality doesn't mean this. Our idea of what constitutes reality is very limited. This includes the world, religion, and even God. In many areas, we don't know exactly what is real. But the goal of reaching what is real, and having beliefs and behaving accordingly, is the fundamental parameter of rationality. No matter what, I will act in this way. If you say you'll act without considering whether something is real, you've lost your rationality.
So, we always need to keep in mind whether something is real or not. Then, are you saying that we should accept this as a criterion and act accordingly?
Yes. Rationality is realized in a person's beliefs and actions. Otherwise, it's simply not possible to talk about a rational object, a rational world, or a rational religion. Rationality is in our opposing attitudes. That's why we can talk about something like this, maybe. You can hold the same belief rationally, or you can hold it through irrational means. But it's the same belief. For example, the existence of God. You might have a very rational belief, but you could also believe in the existence of God in an irrational way. The main difference between these two is rational. Is the anxiety that what is happening is real. So there really is a God. That's what I want to believe. Or you might believe just because everyone else does. Or maybe you believe because it feels easier.
Comfortable path.
You might believe simply because it's comfortable. There could be many different reasons why you believe, or why you don't believe. For example, it's comfortable. Sometimes, not believing can also feel comfortable. To believe rationally means that I believe by thinking about and caring about what is actually true. It means to research this, to know it, and to make an effort about it.
In general, religious beliefs in society are seen as far from rationality, as something on a much higher level. They're seen as spiritual, otherworldly, as something not of this world, even more so. Why did we make this distinction? I mean, why is it still being maintained in this situation? Or how can this distinction disappear? How can this overlap be achieved?
Actually, this is a habit that has spread not only among believers, but also among non-believers. I mean, regarding faith. There is a perception about whether the object of faith can be rational or not. The historical reasons for this perception are another topic, but we need to analyze a bit what kind of perception it is. For example, we can compare whether belief in the existence of God is rational or not to the following. Now, let's say there's someone among us. They know why the number pi came about. In other words, they know how pi is derived from a circle due to geometric reasons, from the relationship between calculations and the radius. So, but let's say they only know 4 digits after the decimal point. At most, that's all they remember. Now, let's say another person has memorized 50 digits of pi after the decimal point. Now, we have to decide whose knowledge is more rational. That's the point here. The person who knows 50 digits might seem like they know more, of course. But let's say they get one of those 50 digits wrong, or if they recite what they've memorized incorrectly, they won't realize they've made a mistake. But the person who knows how to calculate pi, in other words, the one who knows where it comes from, and the one who knows what can be done with it, even if they have to calculate each digit of pi every time, has a more rational belief. When it comes to pi, they have a more rational understanding. We can apply this same idea to religious beliefs as well. In fact, this is the criterion of rationality in all beliefs. Even in religious beliefs, you might believe in the existence of God for any. You may believe why. You might have your own reasons for believing as well. There are also thinkers who see it this way. Actually, this is a basic belief. There are also thinkers like Plantinga who say we don't need reasons to believe in the existence of God. In other words, we call these people fideists or reformist epistemologists. They say this is a basic belief. They claim there is no reason for it. But if we look at it a bit more, from a natural perspective, if we look at it from the standpoint of nature, there actually isn't any belief without a reason. In other words, we don't really have enough evidence to say that any belief is innate. But we can see that some of our beliefs are much more fundamental than things like coming from society or being based on language. So, does the fact that these basic beliefs are fundamental mean that they are rational? Now, according to reformist epistemologists, yes, it does. No matter what the belief is, this belief is considered rational. For example, the belief that the world didn't start 5 minutes ago. We don't know this. I mean the whole world, with all its existence, with all its knowledge, could have been started 5 minutes ago, and you could have been given these memories. It could have been started with these memories. Is this logically possible? It's possible, but nobody believes this. None of us would believe this, because our basic belief is this: the world existed before we did, and the world will continue to exist after we are gone. But what is the rational basis for this fundamental belief? This is where the important point lies. Even if we have adopted belief in God as a basic belief, I think it's important why we continue to hold this belief for it to be considered rational. This is where rationality comes into play. I wonder if it is in our perception of the world or our perception of things, in our efforts to make sense of ourselves. Where does God stand? Belief in God, creation. What does it mean? We talk about rationality here based on the relationships between these things. So, when a counterexample or an objection arises, what can we do? What can we say? What can we turn to? Rationality. That's what we need to look for here.
In that case, we need a great deal of abstraction. In other words, we need to set aside the environment we were born into, our family, our culture, everything, and examine our belief in God, our religious belief, on its own. We need to question it separately from all other details and reach the foundation that way. That's how I understood it. So, how possible is it to actually do this?
The fact that it is possible is actually why we have a 2,500-year-old philosophical tradition. And God has been questioned extensively. In other words, reality has been questioned. God, or well, the topics that we include today under what we call philosophy of religion have been discussed by people for thousands of years. They are being debated, and not only are the boundaries unclear, but maybe the very fact that the boundaries aren't clear is what makes it rational. For example, up to a certain point in time, human experience was also thought to be limitless. But how is your experience? Could be observed, and how? It could be turned into recurring patterns, We were able to transform it into scientific research at certain levels. Philosophical views. So, for example, physics, biology, then later sociology, psychology, and finally, anthropology. The transformation of these into sciences actually shows us how we can set limits on certain beliefs. But when it comes to religious belief, we can't find its rationality within these limitations. Why? Because the object of that belief is limitless. I mean, if we could limit God, if we could define him. In other words, as the old saying goes, the members are the mosque and the setting is the mania, a definition so comprehensive that it includes everything about him. If we could conceive of such a definition, if we could believe based on that definition, the very object itself would cease to exist. Therefore, we shouldn't confuse the rationality of religion here with scientific rationality. We're not just talking about two different kinds of rationality. In fact, we're talking about countless forms of rationality. This is a bit like the following. For example, when we look at a painting by Michelangelo, there is a science involved. That is, which colors he used and how, which objects he depicted and in what way, maybe even. We could even talk about some cognitive scientific data regarding why it's so impressive. But what he creates is art, and it's not something that can be explained by any kind of scientific rationality. We can talk about a different kind of rationality at play in art. For some people, it actually takes place in a realm that isn't rational. Art. Religion also takes place in the non-rational realm, or here is literature. Poetry, for instance, happens in the non-rational realm. I think these are all put forth from a mistaken perspective. Because in that case, rationality gets reduced entirely to scientific rationality. And that's limited to fields that can be repeated and defined. But our reality, like our subjective reality, our beliefs, God, art, these are not things that can be limited. But that doesn't mean they're outside of rationality either. Because we can still think about them, and by aiming for reality, we can approach them.
So, just like we can't say a painting is right or wrong, or real or not, using scientific criteria, the same goes for religion. You're saying we need to look at it and evaluate it in a way that's removed from the criteria of scientific rationality.
Of course, that means it's not scientific. But it doesn't mean it's not rational or can't be rational. That doesn't mean it shouldn't happen. Because if we set science as the paradigm for what we call rationality, we would also eliminate the philosophical framework that allows us to explain sciences focused solely on nature or physics.
So, do we need to look at all belief systems from the same rational perspective here? Or can each one have its own? Can the rationality of each be evaluated separately as well?
Since we can observe many different realities and position ourselves according to these various realities, we also possess many different forms of rationality. For example, let me give you an example from psychological reality. That is, you have your own reality. How you perceive the world, how you perceive yourself, how you feel, and in the flow of your days, yes. You have a reality about how you position yourself. Right. Now, if we try to measure this reality scientifically, actually you are kind of. Uh-huh. You experience certain things as a result of your behaviors, as well as certain signals in your brain. But we are not just made up of these experiences. In response to them, we also have a psychological reality. Let me put it this way, for example. You have a dream. A dream. The scientific explanation for the dream, you see, might be certain stimulations in the brain. Now, that's the scientific part. But how that dream makes you feel, for example, let's say you saw someone you lost in your dream, but you didn't feel sad. There's no scientific explanation for why you didn't feel sad. So, both having the dream and how you react to it, yes, things like that are part of your reality, your psychological reality. And in this sense, just as reality there has a different meaning, rationality also has its own distinct meaning. If, for example, We have limited rationality in psychology entirely to the scientific field. We might have thought that our goal was a very ideal, almost robot-like human being. Now, let's think about religion in the same way. If we try to confine the rationality of religion entirely within scientific rationality, then what we encounter is this. At most, there is a power in the world that we call God. We can talk about its reflections, but believing in religion or the reality of religion is not like that. Religion, especially theistic religions, like Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, are religions that posit the real existence of a creator to whom the world is dependent, and who is not dependent on anything else. So, meaning is found within this reality. We can also approach rationality from this angle. We can understand rationality in this way. Does such a God really exist? And if there is, what does it mean? What kind of being is that existence? When we think about these questions, we can say that religious belief is rational.
At this point, we can explain that religious belief is rational. But when explaining certain situations or events in religion, do we also need to evaluate them by looking at the religion's own rationality? Because here, we sometimes see that miracles or situations that are scientifically impossible, things that could never happen in the real world, have a place in religion. Should we evaluate these within the religion's own rationality and say that anything is possible? In this case,
Actually, saying that anything is possible is not a rational approach. Because we can't say that either from a religious or a scientific perspective. But what we can say is that we might not know the reasons behind certain things. That's a very rational approach. It's the same in both religion and science. For example, if you believe that someone can travel from one place to another without any means, if you believe that someone can go from one place to another without walking or any intermediary, on what basis do you attribute reality? Do you attribute reality to? I heard that. So if you say this is how it happened, it is not a rational belief. But this can happen because we are here. Just recently discovered the theory of relativity. For instance, humanity didn't know about this 100 years ago. People thought of time and space as absolute. Now, when we look at this, we can only say the following. In fact, rationality shows that there is a certain reality and that this reality can go beyond our current knowledge. We are able to realize this. So we can accept this both in scientific rationality and in religious rationality. In other words, saying that there is a causality in what we call miracles or what we call karamat, extraordinary acts attributed to saints, does not diminish their religious value. Rather, it means we can provide a religiously rational explanation for them. So here is Hertz. Moses parting the sea. If we believe that this event happened in a magical way rather than naturally, that doesn't mean we are rationally believing in its miraculous nature. No, in this case, it's not rational. It's done entirely by a force outside of nature. If you say that, then we could attribute this to everything. That would mean saying that anything is possible, and that means going beyond the limits of rationality. So I don't know the reasons why this happened. You can still rationally believe in this event.
but here in our religious belief, we're talking about an unlimited and infinite God. When we look at it that way, shouldn't we say that anything is possible?
How do we even know that anything is possible? I mean, our belief that this unlimited and infinite God can do anything he wants could also be wrong. Even thinking that he wants something could be wrong, because wanting is something unique to humans. So all we can really say is this. For example, we don't know the reasons behind what he does. We don't know how he makes it happen. Therefore, I can rationally believe in the event that takes place there. But the event itself might seem unreal to us right now. Like I said, if our goal is to believe in something that truly happened, then we can be rational. Otherwise, for example, if we told people 100 years ago, let's say that Actually, we should go back even more centuries. 150 years ago, people were talking about telephones, mobile phones, or video calls, and the internet. They would have thought these were miraculous things. But in reality, we started using these because we discovered something in nature called radio waves. So, instead of thinking that nature ends and then miracles begin, we now have a point that we can actually understand. Saying, this part is nature, and beyond this is a miracle, is a much more rational approach.
This way, it's more explanatory, at least for me. So, when we look at it across all times, it's actually about what's possible. Since we only look at things from the perspective of our own era and within the limits of our own capacity, sometimes we see things as impossible or irrational. But what we've actually been talking about are situations that could happen in ways we don't know or understand. That's how it is.
Yes, we don't have full knowledge of nature either. For example, we don't know its limits. We create our own truths. Like saying water boils at 100 degrees, we form a reality. But as you know, water doesn't boil at 100 degrees everywhere. So, as we discover these things, we get to talk more about water. We get more opportunities to discuss it. And to believe in something rationally requires this, within the framework of scientific rationality. Our knowledge is always limited, and the framework we draw is what comes to pass. If we apply the same thing to religion, we need to say this. What we know may be limitless, but our knowledge about it will always be limited.
Well, Professor, thank you very much. Thank you for your valuable comments. Dear viewers, we talked about the rationality of religion today. See you in the next episode. Goodbye.